Welcome to Sleepy Dungeons. Tonight, we open a chapter of history that has fascinated scholars, adventurers, and storytellers for over 2 millennia. This is the tale of Alexander the Great, the young king who carved out an empire larger than the imagination of his own age and the mystery of his vanished tomb. His conquests reshaped the ancient world, spreading Greek culture and influence across continents, but what became of him after his death has remained one of the greatest enigmas in archaeology. The conqueror who wanted to be remembered forever disappeared into legend, his final resting place still hidden. Alexander was born in Macedon in 356 BC, the son of King Philip II and Queen Olympias. From the beginning, his life was touched by prophecy and myth. His mother whispered that he was descended from Achilles, and the philosopher Aristotle tutored him in philosophy, science, and politics. As a boy, he tamed the wild stallion Bucephalus, proving not only courage but insight into the nature of fear itself. He was still a teenager when he commanded troops, and by 20, he was king. What followed was a whirlwind: victories against Persia, the founding of Alexandria, and an empire that stretched from Greece to India. But behind all of this, a story was being written not only about his life, but about the mystery of his death. When Alexander died suddenly in Babylon in 323 BC, the world was stunned. He was just 32 years old, undefeated in battle, yet struck down by fever or perhaps by poison, depending on which ancient source you believe. His body became an object of desire and power. Whoever possessed it could claim a connection to his legacy. The golden carriage that carried his remains was intercepted and diverted to Egypt, where Ptolemy, his general, installed it as a trophy of legitimacy. Ancient accounts tell us that the tomb of Alexander became a shrine in Alexandria, visited by Roman emperors and described as one of the wonders of its age. Yet somehow, between late antiquity and the present day, it vanished completely. This is the story that draws us in tonight. How could the final resting place of one of the most famous figures in all of human history be lost? Did natural disasters or the chaos of conquest bury it beneath layers of Alexandria's shifting sands? Was it destroyed by invading armies, or was it secretly hidden away by those who feared it might be desecrated? Or does it still lie somewhere beneath the city, waiting for the right moment and the right hands to uncover it? These questions form one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of archaeology. In this episode, we will retrace the journey of Alexander the Great, his birth and rise to power, the brilliant conquests that defined his golden age, the cracks that began to show in his reign, and the sudden decline that ended his life. We will explore the mysteries of his lost tomb, the theories that surround it, and the legacy that has kept him alive in history for over 2,000 years. And in the end, we will reflect on the unanswered questions that continue to haunt us, questions that may one day be answered, or may remain forever buried. The story of Alexander is not just about war and empire. It is about ambition without limits, about the blending of cultures, about mortality, and about how memory is shaped not by certainty but by mystery. His life was extraordinary, but his death transformed him into something greater still, a legend whose absence is as powerful as his presence once was. So prepare yourself, for tonight we begin our journey into the world of Alexander the Great. We will walk the path of his rise, his triumphs, his decline, and his mysteries. And as always, we will leave you with questions only you can answer. What really happened to the tomb of the Conqueror, and why does its silence still echo so loudly in the halls of history? Long before Alexander became the figure we remember today, his story was shaped by the land, the people, and the myths of Macedon. In the rugged northern edges of the Greek world, where mountains and fertile plains met, a kingdom was growing in strength. It was here, in the city of Pella, that Alexander was born in 356 BC, the son of King Philip II and Olympias. Macedon was not yet the shining beacon of empire, but a frontier kingdom, regarded by the Greeks of Athens and Sparta as half-barbarian, a land of warriors rather than philosophers. Yet it was precisely this mixture of toughness, ambition, and hunger for recognition that would produce a man who would change history. From the very start, Alexander's life was framed by omens and prophecies. Ancient writers tell us that on the night he was born, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned to the ground, interpreted as a sign that the goddess of Asia had withdrawn her protection because a greater force had come into the world. His mother, Olympias, whispered to her son that he was no ordinary child. She claimed that lightning had entered her womb, that Alexander was the son of Zeus himself. Whether or not he believed her fully, these stories became the foundation of his identity, a conviction that he was destined for greatness. As a boy, Alexander was restless, sharp, and fiercely competitive. His father, Philip, had transformed Macedon into a formidable military power, reorganizing the phalanx and defeating rivals across Greece. Yet Philip also knew that his son needed more than brute force, he needed intellect. And so he secured the services of one of the greatest minds of the age, Aristotle. Under the philosopher's tutelage, Alexander absorbed lessons in philosophy, science, medicine, and literature. He learned of Homer's epics and embraced Achilles as his role model, carrying a copy of the Iliad with him on campaign. This dual inheritance, the warrior's spirit from his father and the philosopher's vision from his teacher, shaped the young man who would one day claim the world. Even in his youth, Alexander displayed the qualities that set him apart. The story of Bucephalus, the wild horse no one could tame, remains one of the most famous. At just 12 years old, Alexander noticed what no one else had: the horse was afraid of its own shadow. He turned Bucephalus toward the sun, mounted him, and rode him into submission. Philip watched in awe and is said to have declared, "My son, you must find a kingdom great enough for your ambition. Macedon will not contain you." Those words, whether truly spoken or later invented, reflected the truth: Alexander's spirit was too vast for the narrow borders of his homeland. As he grew older, Alexander's courage and leadership became undeniable. At 16, left to govern in his father's absence, he crushed a rebellion and founded his first city, Alexandropolis. At 18, he commanded cavalry at the Battle of Chaeronea, where he broke the sacred band of Thebes, one of the most elite forces in Greece. These victories were not small acts of loyalty, they were demonstrations of a young man already proving himself equal to seasoned commanders. The soldiers began to trust him, the Greeks began to fear him, and his father began to sense that Alexander's destiny might eclipse even his own. Yet destiny is often born in blood. In 336 BC, during a grand festival, Philip II was assassinated. The murder was sudden, shocking, and wrapped in suspicion. Some claimed it was the work of a disgruntled bodyguard. Others whispered that Olympias had a hand in it, clearing the path for her son. Whatever the truth, Philip's death propelled Alexander to the throne at just 20 years old. Many doubted that someone so young could rule a kingdom, let alone command an empire. But Alexander silenced doubt quickly and brutally. He eliminated rivals to the throne, asserted control over rebellious Greek city-states, and demanded obedience. His authority was not requested, it was imposed. The world he inherited was already unstable, and yet Alexander transformed instability into opportunity. Greece was fractured, Persia loomed as a formidable rival, and Macedonia's grip on its allies was tenuous. But Alexander's ambition knew no limits. Unlike his father, whose vision had focused on Greece, Alexander looked east, toward the immense Persian Empire. To him, conquest was not merely about territory but about immortality. Every victory would move him closer to godhood, every city would carry his name, every battle would confirm the whispers that he was more than mortal. As he stood at the edge of his kingdom, the world stretched before him like a challenge, daring him to seize it. The rugged boy of Pella had become a king, armed with Aristotle's wisdom, Philip's army, and Olympias's belief in divine destiny. Already, stories circulated of his charisma, his ability to inspire loyalty, and his fierce presence in battle. To his soldiers, he was not merely a commander, he was a leader who shared their dangers, who fought at the front, whose courage burned as brightly as his ambition. This was the birth of Alexander's legend. It began not in the heart of empire but on the margins, not in grandeur but in prophecy, blood, and fire. The seeds of greatness were sown in a land dismissed as barbarian, nurtured by a mother who believed in destiny, a father who built an army, and a philosopher who gave him vision. By the time he ascended the throne, Alexander was not simply a king, he was a storm about to break upon the world, a force that no wall, no army, and no empire would stand against. And yet, in these early years, the outlines of his fate were already present. The ambition that would make him immortal would also plant the seeds of suspicion, betrayal, and collapse. For now, though, the stage was set, the armies gathered, and the young king prepared to step into history. The world did not yet know it, but Alexander of Macedon was about to become Alexander the Great. Alexander's golden age began the moment he crossed into Asia, carrying with him not only the weight of Macedon but the ambitions of a man who believed he was destined to rule the world. In the spring of 334 BC, with an army of roughly 40,000 men, he marched eastward across the Hellespont, the narrow strait dividing Europe from Asia. As he stepped onto Persian soil, legend says he cast a spear into the ground, declaring that he had claimed Asia as a gift from the gods. It was not merely a symbolic act, but a declaration of intent. This was not to be a campaign of raids or plunder. It was a war of conquest, and Alexander would accept nothing less than total victory. His first great test came almost immediately at the Battle of the Granicus River. The Persian satraps had gathered their forces, confident they could crush the young invader before he gained a foothold. Alexander, leading his cavalry personally, charged across the river and into the Persian lines. The fighting was brutal, and at one point Alexander's life hung by a thread when a Persian nobleman struck him with such force that only the intervention of a companion saved him. Bloody but unbroken, Alexander pressed forward. By the day's end, the Persians were routed, and Asia Minor lay open to him. The victory was not just military, it was psychological. The aura of invincibility began to gather around him, a sense that he was guided by fate itself. From Granicus, he advanced deeper into Persian territory, capturing city after city. His reputation preceded him, and many places surrendered without resistance. Yet when Darius III, the Persian king, finally moved to confront him, Alexander faced an enemy far greater in size and resources. At Issus in 333 BC, Alexander's smaller force found itself facing an army that dwarfed his own. Darius positioned himself in the center, surrounded by his elite guards, while his troops stretched across the plain. Where others might have hesitated, Alexander saw opportunity. With a calculated maneuver, he led a wedge of cavalry directly into the heart of the Persian line, breaking through to Darius himself. Faced with the ferocity of the attack, the great king lost his nerve and fled, abandoning his family and treasures. The victory at Issus confirmed what Granicus had suggested. Alexander was not just another ambitious warlord, he was a force of destiny. The march continued south, where the fortified city of Tyre stood defiant. Tyre was an island stronghold, proud and impregnable, a city that had withstood countless threats. Alexander, however, refused to be denied. For 7 months, he laid siege, constructing a massive causeway across the sea to bring his war machines within reach of the city walls. The effort was grueling, and the resistance fierce, but eventually Tyre fell. The punishment was swift and merciless, thousands were killed, and survivors sold into slavery. The world understood the message, resistance to Alexander meant annihilation. From Tyre, Alexander moved into Egypt, where he was received not as a conqueror but as a liberator. The Egyptians, long oppressed under Persian rule, welcomed him as a God-sent deliverer. It was in Egypt that he founded one of his greatest legacies, the city of Alexandria. Positioned strategically on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria would grow into a center of learning, trade, and culture, a city whose name still echoes with grandeur. In the desert, Alexander made a pilgrimage to the Oracle of Siwa, where the priests greeted him as the son of Zeus-Ammon. Whether by chance or by arrangement, the oracle's declaration reinforced the belief that Alexander was more than mortal. He embraced the title, and with it, the divine aura that made his soldiers see him not just as a king, but as a figure touched by the gods. The decisive moment of his golden age came at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC. Here, Darius once again assembled an enormous army, said to number in the hundreds of thousands, supported by war chariots fitted with scythes. The odds were staggering, but Alexander was undaunted. He deliberately stretched his lines, drawing the Persians outward until a gap opened in their center. With precision and daring, Alexander led his cavalry directly through the breach, striking at Darius once more. The great king fled for the second time, and his empire crumbled. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, jewels of Persia, fell into Alexander's hands. At Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, Alexander allowed his men to plunder, and in a moment that remains debated, he ordered the palace burned. Some say it was revenge for the Persian invasion of Greece a century earlier. Others claim it was the drunken whim of a conqueror carried away by triumph. Whatever the reason, the burning of Persepolis became a symbol of the end of Persia and the beginning of a new order under Alexander. But conquest was not enough for him. Alexander dreamed of more than empire, he dreamed of unity. He began to adopt Persian customs, wearing their robes and participating in their rituals. He encouraged intermarriage between his soldiers and Persian women, attempting to fuse Greek and Eastern cultures into one. To many Macedonians, this was an insult to their traditions, but Alexander's vision was larger than their understanding. He was shaping not just a kingdom, but a world. His march eastward took him through the rugged lands of Central Asia, where resistance was constant. In Bactria, he faced fierce opposition and spent years quelling revolts, marrying Roxana, a local princess, in a bid to secure loyalty. Even in these harsh campaigns, Alexander showed the same relentless drive, never allowing setbacks to deter him. His gaze was always fixed on the horizon, always hungry for what lay beyond. That hunger carried him into India in 326 BC, where he faced King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes River. Porus's army included war elephants, beasts that terrified Alexander's soldiers. The battle was fought in driving rain, the ground soaked with mud and blood. Alexander's tactics, however, prevailed once again, and Porus was defeated. Impressed by his valor, Alexander did something remarkable. Instead of humiliating his foe, he restored Porus to his throne, making him an ally. It was gestures like these that showed the complexity of Alexander's character. He could be ruthless, but he could also be magnanimous, understanding that loyalty could sometimes be won better through respect than through fear. Yet even at the height of his power, shadows were creeping into his golden age. His men, weary after years of campaigning, began to resist his unending ambition. When he sought to march further east toward the Ganges, they refused, demanding to return home. For the first time, Alexander's rule was denied, not by an enemy, but by his own army. Though reluctant, he relented, turning back. Still, the empire he had created stretched from Greece to India, an expanse greater than any before him. In these years of glory, Alexander's image became almost godlike. He was depicted in art as a young man with flowing hair and piercing eyes, a figure both human and divine. Cities bearing his name sprang up across the empire, each a monument to his ambition. He spread Greek language, culture, and ideas wherever he went, laying the foundation for the Hellenistic world that would flourish long after his death. His golden age was not only about conquest, it was about transformation. He had reshaped the known world, altering its culture, politics, and identity forever. Alexander's golden age was brilliance and brutality entwined, vision and violence interwoven. It was an age of astonishing achievements, the fall of Persia, the founding of Alexandria, the uniting of cultures, but also of excess, cruelty, and ambition without restraint. In his triumphs, he seemed unstoppable, a man touched by destiny, a conqueror who blurred the line between mortal and God. And yet, even in his victories, the seeds of decline were already being sown, waiting to rise and challenge him in the years to come. The decline of Alexander the Great was as dramatic as his rise, though it unfolded not through defeat in battle, for he remained undefeated to the end, but through the fractures within his empire, his court, and his own mind. At first, the signs were subtle, barely noticeable against the backdrop of endless triumphs. His army still marched, his empire still expanded, and his legend still grew. Yet beneath the surface, strains were pulling at the foundation of his power, and the man who had once seemed invincible began to reveal the frailty of mortality. Tension with his men grew steadily after the victory in India. The soldiers who had followed him from Macedon, through Asia Minor, across Persia, and into the unforgiving lands of the East, had reached their limits. They were hardened by years of war, but also exhausted, longing for home, for families left behind, for rest after endless campaigns. At the Hyphasis River, when Alexander sought to push further into India, they resisted him openly. For the first time, his authority was challenged not by an enemy but by the weariness of his own army. Alexander raged, pleaded, and promised greater glory, but the men stood firm. Their refusal forced him to turn back. Though he remained their leader, the moment revealed a limit to his command. The aura of absolute control had cracked. As he returned westward, a shadow of paranoia began to follow him. Alexander had always been ruthless when it came to rivals, but now he turned that ruthlessness inward, toward his friends and companions. The most notorious example was the death of Clitus the Black, a trusted officer who had once saved Alexander's life in battle. During a drunken banquet, Clitus criticized Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and his growing distance from Macedonian traditions. The insult struck deep. In a sudden fury, Alexander seized a spear and killed Clitus on the spot. The room fell silent, his soldiers stunned. In the aftermath, Alexander was consumed with remorse, locking himself away in grief, but the act could not be undone. His men had seen their king murder a loyal companion in a fit of rage. Trust was shaken, and whispers of fear spread through the ranks. Adopting Persian customs was another source of conflict. Alexander increasingly presented himself not just as a king, but as a god-king, demanding obeisance in the form of proskynesis, bowing to the ground before him. To Persians, this was a normal gesture of respect. To Macedonians, it was blasphemous. They had followed him as a man, even as a great man, but not as a god. His insistence on divine honors widened the rift between him and those who had marched at his side from the beginning. He seemed determined to forge unity between East and West, but in doing so, he risked alienating both. The empire itself began to strain under its own vastness. Revolts erupted in far-flung provinces, forcing Alexander into constant campaigns to reassert control. In Bactria and Sogdiana, resistance was fierce, demanding years of brutal fighting. Though Alexander triumphed, the victories were costly, draining resources and lives. To secure loyalty, he married Roxana, a local princess, but this only deepened resentment among his Macedonian officers, who saw it as further proof that he was abandoning his roots. The vision of a blended empire was noble in theory, but fragile in practice. Instead of harmony, it bred suspicion, division, and discontent. As the years dragged on, Alexander himself began to change. The man who had once shared dangers with his soldiers, fighting at the front and earning their love, grew more isolated. He surrounded himself with rituals, courtiers, and luxury, increasingly removed from the men who had bled for his conquests. His drinking grew heavier, his temper shorter, his suspicions sharper. Friends who had once been trusted now faced accusations of treason. Parmenion, one of his oldest generals, was executed after his son was implicated in a plot. Whether the plot was real or imagined, the message was clear: no one was safe. Fear began to replace loyalty, and the court grew tense with paranoia. The march homeward brought more hardships. Crossing the Gedrosian desert, Alexander lost countless men to thirst, hunger, and exhaustion. It was a grueling reminder that even the greatest conqueror could not command nature. The suffering of his army contrasted sharply with the image of a leader who seemed increasingly consumed by dreams of divinity and endless conquest. His soldiers admired him still, but the bond of shared struggle was fraying. By the time Alexander reached Babylon in 323 BC, he was no longer the same man who had once charged across the Granicus River with youthful fire. He had become a ruler of immense power, but also immense burdens. Plans were already underway for new campaigns, including an invasion of Arabia, as if the entire world were not yet enough for him. But fate intervened. After a night of heavy drinking at a banquet, Alexander fell ill. The sickness struck quickly, bringing fever and paralysis. Over the course of several days, he weakened steadily, unable to rise, unable to speak. His generals, desperate for answers, gathered around his bed. When asked who should inherit his empire, he is said to have whispered only, "to the strongest." Whether those were truly his last words or a legend added later, they captured the chaos that would follow. On June 10, 323 BC, Alexander the Great died at just 32 years old. His passing was almost incomprehensible to those who had followed him. This was a man who had seemed invincible, untouchable, destined to defy mortality itself. Yet in the end, he was undone not by an enemy in battle, but by sickness, or perhaps by poison, depending on which account one believes. His death shattered the illusion of divinity, revealing that even the greatest conqueror could not escape the limits of human life. The aftermath was immediate and brutal. With no clear heir, his generals, the Diadochi, carved up his empire, each seizing territory for himself. The unity Alexander had dreamed had dissolved into decades of war, betrayal, and bloodshed. His vision of East and West fused into one empire died with him, leaving behind only fragments and memories. The decline of Alexander was not a single fall, but a series of fractures: the rebellion of his men, the killing of friends, the clash of cultures, the strains of empire, and finally the mystery of his death. Though he remained undefeated in battle, he could not conquer mortality, nor could he command loyalty beyond the grave. The man who had once seemed destined to rule forever was reduced to silence, leaving behind an empire in turmoil and a legend that would outlast the ruins of his conquests. For all his victories, for all the vastness of the empire he carved, it is not only Alexander's life that grips us, but the unanswered questions that followed his death. Chief among them is the mystery of his tomb. Where was the greatest conqueror of the ancient world finally laid to rest, and why has it been lost to us for over 2,000 years? Ancient accounts tell us that Alexander's body became a prize immediately after his death, fought over by those who wished to cloak themselves in his glory. At first, the plan was to return him to Macedon, to bury him alongside his ancestors. A magnificent funeral carriage was prepared, decorated with gold and jewels, said to be so elaborate that it was a moving palace in itself. Yet before it could reach its destination, Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, intercepted it and diverted the body to Egypt. For Ptolemy, Alexander's remains were not only sacred, they were political. To house the conqueror in his new capital gave his rule legitimacy, anchoring his claim to power in the memory of a man already becoming a legend. According to the records of Strabo and later Roman writers, Alexander's body was placed first in Memphis and then transferred to Alexandria, the city he had founded. There it was enshrined in a great mausoleum, often referred to as the Soma. Emperors from Rome traveled to see it. Julius Caesar is said to have paid his respects, and Augustus reportedly touched the embalmed body with his own hand. For centuries, the tomb stood as a shrine, a monument visited by pilgrims and rulers alike, a place where the man who had united East and West still seemed to rest in silent majesty. But then, the trail vanishes. By the 3rd century AD, mentions of the tomb grow scarce. By the 4th, they disappear altogether. No ruins, no fragments, no reliable record remains. How could a monument so celebrated, so revered, vanish from the face of the earth? Some argue that it was destroyed during riots in Alexandria as Christianity rose and pagan monuments were targeted. Others suggest it was swallowed by natural disaster, buried under the shifting ground of a city built on unstable coasts, shaken by earthquakes, and reshaped by the Mediterranean Sea. Still others whisper that the tomb was deliberately hidden, moved in secret to protect it from desecration, its location erased from history so thoroughly that it could never be found. The theories are as fascinating as they are numerous. Archaeologists have searched beneath modern Alexandria, convinced that the tomb must lie under layers of later construction, waiting to be uncovered. The problem is that Alexandria itself has been destroyed and rebuilt so many times, by fire, war, and flood, that entire districts have disappeared into the sea. To find Alexander's tomb would mean unearthing not just one layer of history, but many, each one built over the ruins of the last. Some scholars suggest the body may not even be in Alexandria at all, but hidden elsewhere. Perhaps it was moved back toward Macedon, as originally intended, or perhaps it rests in Siwa, at the very oracle that had once declared Alexander as son of the gods. Stranger tales abound as well. Medieval travelers spoke of a tomb that might have been Alexander's, though details never matched. Some legends claim that Napoleon, during his Egyptian campaign, stumbled upon fragments of the lost tomb, though nothing was ever produced as evidence. Whispers circulate that the body was so perfectly preserved that those who saw it centuries later thought Alexander was merely sleeping. Others suggest that rulers across time may have deliberately obscured its location, jealous of the power the tomb conferred on those who possessed it. The contradictions in ancient texts only deepen the mystery. Some writers describe emperors visiting the tomb long after others insist it was already lost. Was there more than one burial place, one a decoy and the other the true resting place? Did scribes deliberately confuse the record to protect the tomb, or to aggrandize their patrons? These inconsistencies leave historians with more questions than answers, and it is these questions that fuel the imagination. Even today, the search continues. Modern excavations in Alexandria reveal wonders constantly: temples, statues, traces of the ancient city, but no definitive sign of Alexander's resting place. Some argue it may already have been destroyed, lost forever. Others remain convinced it is still there, beneath the streets and waters of a modern city, waiting for the right moment and the right discovery. The absence of proof does not weaken the mystery, it strengthens it. For every year the tomb remains lost, Alexander's legend grows. There is something haunting in this disappearance. Alexander was a man obsessed with immortality, with leaving a mark so deep that time itself could not erase it. His victories, his cities, his cultural legacy, all of these endure. But his body, the most tangible reminder of his existence, has been swallowed by history. Perhaps that is the final irony. In seeking immortality, he achieved it not through preservation, but through absence. The conqueror whose empire spanned the world now lives forever in the shadow of a tomb that no one can find. The mystery of Alexander's tomb is not just an archaeological puzzle, it is a reminder of the limits of history. No matter how great, how powerful, or how revered, even the mightiest can vanish. And yet, in vanishing, they may achieve the very immortality they desired. Alexander's body is gone, but the search for it keeps him alive in imagination, in story, in legend. Every unanswered question sustains the fire of curiosity, ensuring that the conqueror remains not only a figure of the past but a presence in the present. Alexander's legacy is one of the most enduring in all of history, a tapestry woven of conquest, culture, and myth that continues to shape the world even after more than 2,000 years. Though his empire fractured almost immediately upon his death, the imprint of his ambition and vision outlasted the borders he drew with his sword. What he created was not just a political order, but a cultural transformation that came to be known as the Hellenistic world, a fusion of Greek ideas with the traditions of Egypt, Persia, and beyond. In many ways, this blending was more powerful than the empire itself, because it survived long after the territories were lost. The city of Alexandria in Egypt stands as the most visible emblem of this legacy. Founded by Alexander in 331 BC, it was not merely a city but a statement of intent, a place where cultures met, where trade and knowledge flourished, and where Greek influence would dominate the Mediterranean for centuries. Alexandria became home to the Great Library, a repository of human knowledge that drew scholars from across the world. Though the library is long gone, its reputation as a center of learning is remembered as a symbol of Alexander's dream, a place where ideas, not just armies, conquered. Beyond Alexandria, the cities he established across his empire carried his name and his influence far and wide. More than 20 bore the name Alexandria, each serving as a hub of Greek culture planted in foreign soil. These cities became melting pots, where Greek language and customs mingled with local traditions. The spread of the Greek tongue created a common language that facilitated trade, diplomacy, and the exchange of ideas across lands once divided. This cultural unification was perhaps Alexander's most lasting conquest, for it outlived the empire itself and laid the foundation for later civilizations. His military genius also left a legacy that never faded. Generals and strategists through the ages studied his campaigns, marveling at his ability to adapt, improvise, and inspire. His tactics at battles such as Issus and Gaugamela became textbooks for war, lessons in the power of speed, surprise, and decisive leadership. Leaders from Hannibal to Napoleon looked to Alexander as a model, measuring their own ambitions against his impossible standard. Few equaled him, but all recognized the shadow he cast. The vision of cultural fusion he attempted, though controversial in his own time, also endured. By adopting Persian customs, marrying into local dynasties, and encouraging his soldiers to do the same, Alexander set the stage for the rise of a cosmopolitan world. The Hellenistic kingdoms that followed his empire, the Seleucids in Asia, the Ptolemies in Egypt, and others, carried on this blending of cultures. Greek gods fused with Egyptian deities, Greek art took on Eastern forms, and philosophies traveled across borders. This hybrid civilization produced advances in science, philosophy, and the arts that influenced Rome and, through Rome, the modern West. Alexander's image itself became a legend. To the Greeks, he was the new Achilles, fulfilling the heroic code. To the Egyptians, he was Pharaoh and son of the gods. To Persians, he was remembered with both awe and resentment, the destroyer and the unifier. In later centuries, his story entered Islamic and Christian traditions, where he appeared in new guises, sometimes as a seeker of knowledge, sometimes as a protector against chaos. The very fact that so many cultures claimed him in their stories shows how deeply he penetrated the imagination of the world. Archaeology continues to reveal how deeply his influence was felt. Coins bearing his face were minted across his empire, showing him with the ram's horns of Zeus-Ammon, blending Greek and Egyptian imagery. Inscriptions praise his deeds, and ruins of his cities still stand, silent reminders of the man who once dreamed of ruling everything. Each discovery adds weight to the truth that Alexander's mark was not erased by time but etched into its very fabric. His legacy is also carried in the unanswered questions. The absence of his tomb adds to his immortality, turning him into a figure who is never quite finished, never quite buried. The mystery of his final resting place ensures that he is as much a figure of the present as of the past. In a way, the disappearance of his tomb has made him eternal, an unfinished story that each generation feels compelled to seek again. In art and literature, Alexander continues to inspire. From ancient epics to modern novels and films, his life is retold not simply because of his conquests but because it embodies the extremes of human ambition. He was brilliant and ruthless, visionary and flawed, mortal yet determined to be godlike. His story touches something eternal in human nature, the desire to reach beyond limits, to grasp at immortality, to leave behind a mark so deep that time itself cannot erase it. The legacy of Alexander is not only the empire he built, but the world he reshaped. He altered cultures, languages, philosophies, and histories. His vision of unity, though never fully realized, planted the seeds of a global world. He remains a symbol of ambition without boundaries, a conqueror whose shadow stretches across centuries, a man whose life and legend cannot be separated. In the end, he achieved what he sought, immortality, not in the body that has been lost, but in the story that will never be forgotten. By the time Alexander had reached the pinnacle of his power, his golden age had already begun to turn toward decline, and with it came the complex reflections and theories that continue to surround his life and death. When scholars today attempt to make sense of his story, they do not see a simple tale of a boy king who conquered the world, but a layered narrative filled with contradictions, unanswered questions, and interpretations that shift with every generation. The final thoughts and theories about Alexander are as compelling as his victories, for they force us to confront the ultimate mysteries: why he rose so high, why he fell so quickly, and why his memory endures as it does. One of the most enduring debates concerns the cause of his death. The ancient sources disagree, offering stories that range from the mundane to the sinister. Some describe a sudden fever that overwhelmed him after years of exhaustion, exposure, and wounds. Others insist it was poison, perhaps administered by one of his generals or rivals, fearful of his growing demands for divinity and desperate to seize power for themselves. The theory of poisoning remains plausible but difficult to prove. Alexander lingered for several days before succumbing, which does not fit neatly with most poisons known at the time. Still, the suspicion refuses to fade, because it reflects the climate of paranoia and ambition that surrounded his final days. Another theory suggests that his decline was the natural outcome of his relentless ambition. For more than a decade, Alexander had marched without rest, demanding from his body and his men feats that pushed human limits. He suffered wounds in battle, led campaigns in climates ranging from scorching deserts to freezing mountains, and drank heavily in banquets that often blurred into violence. To modern eyes, the collapse of his health may have been inevitable, the price of a life lived at such extremes. Yet this explanation, grounded in physical reality, seems unsatisfying for a man who had lived as if guided by myth. Perhaps that is why stories of divine punishment or betrayal cling so stubbornly to his legacy. His death also opened the door to speculation about his empire's fate. Was it doomed from the start, too vast to be held by any single ruler, or could it have endured had he lived longer? Some historians believe that Alexander's vision of blending cultures might have succeeded if he had had time to consolidate his rule. Others argue that the fractures were already too deep, that the Macedonians resented his Persianizing policies, and that local populations tolerated him only out of fear. The wars of the Diadochi, the successors, who tore his empire apart after his passing, suggest that unity under Alexander may have been less a vision shared by all and more a force imposed by his personal charisma and unmatched authority. Without him, the dream collapsed into bloodshed. Theories about his character are equally divided. Was he truly a visionary, a man ahead of his time who sought to unite rather than merely conquer? Or was he a tyrant cloaked in the guise of greatness, intoxicated by power and incapable of restraint? The truth may lie in the uneasy balance between the two. His efforts to merge cultures through intermarriage, shared rituals, and blended administration were unprecedented, but they also created friction and resistance. His generosity could be extraordinary, yet his cruelty could be merciless, as the burning of Persepolis and the destruction of Thebes attest. These contradictions make him difficult to categorize, and perhaps that is why he continues to fascinate. He was not simply one thing, but many things at once: hero and villain, philosopher and warrior, visionary and destroyer. Even the mystery of his tomb, lost to history, fuels theories that stretch far beyond archaeology. Some argue that the absence of his body has made him immortal in a way that a discovered tomb never could. Had his remains been preserved in a known location, they would have become a static monument, a relic of the past. Instead, the missing tomb keeps him alive in speculation, a riddle that ensures every generation retells his story. Others wonder whether the tomb might still be uncovered, perhaps beneath modern Alexandria, or hidden away in some forgotten corner of the ancient world. The possibility of discovery hangs like a promise, suggesting that history has not yet said its final word on Alexander the Great. For scholars, Alexander represents the ultimate paradox of leadership. He achieved what no one before him dared, uniting lands and cultures under one rule. Yet he could not conquer the internal divisions of his court, the exhaustion of his men, or the frailty of his own body. His greatness was unquestionable, but it was inseparable from the flaws that hastened his end. The theories that surround him, about his death, his empire, his character, and his tomb, reveal as much about us as they do about him. They show our need to explain the inexplicable, to impose order on a life that was lived with reckless abandon, to understand a man who seemed to defy the limits of humanity. In the end, the final thoughts on Alexander are not conclusions but invitations to wonder. He was a conqueror who sought immortality and, in a strange way, achieved it not through certainty but through mystery. His empire crumbled, his tomb vanished, his body disappeared into legend, and yet his name endures, stronger than those of kings who ruled for centuries. Perhaps this is the greatest theory of all, that Alexander's immortality lies not in what was preserved but in what was lost, not in the answers we have but in the questions we cannot resolve. Alexander's reign was not defined only by his battles and conquests, but also by the wealth, culture, and society that grew in the shadow of his ambition. When we look past the marches and the bloodshed, what emerges is a picture of a world in transformation, one where traditions collided and new ways of life were born. To understand the full weight of his legacy, we must look at how ordinary people lived during his rule, how wealth flowed through his empire, and how culture was shaped by the blending of Greek and Eastern traditions. The vast territory Alexander conquered was home to diverse peoples, each with their own customs, languages, and beliefs. In bringing them together under a single authority, Alexander did something remarkable. He created a society in which cultural exchange became inevitable. The Greek language spread rapidly, serving as a common tongue for administration, trade, and learning. Merchants from Greece, Egypt, Persia, and India could communicate in ways that had been impossible before, fueling an explosion of commerce across his empire. With trade came wealth, and with wealth came new opportunities for art, architecture, and philosophy to flourish. In cities like Babylon, Susa, and Alexandria, markets brimmed with goods from every corner of the known world. Spices from India, ivory from Africa, fine textiles from Persia, and wines from Greece flowed through the same stalls. This intermingling of products reflected a deeper intermingling of cultures. The Greeks brought with them not only their language but their architecture, building theaters, temples, and gymnasiums in foreign lands. In return, they adopted elements of local traditions, incorporating Persian and Egyptian symbols into their own practices. The result was a hybrid culture that historians now call Hellenistic, a society that drew strength from its diversity. Wealth in this era was concentrated in the cities Alexander founded or transformed. These urban centers became magnets for settlers, administrators, and scholars. Alexandria in Egypt stood as the jewel among them, a city designed not just for commerce but for knowledge. Though the famous Library of Alexandria would be established after his death, the city itself embodied his vision of a place where cultures could meet. Its great harbor became a hub of trade, while its streets echoed with voices speaking in many tongues. Wealth poured into Alexandria, making it a beacon of prosperity in a world still recovering from conquest. Society under Alexander's rule was complex. At the top stood the Macedonian and Greek elites, who held most of the political and military power. Yet Alexander's policy of integrating local leaders into his administration blurred the rigid lines of hierarchy. Persian nobles found places in his government, Egyptian priests maintained their authority, and local customs were often preserved alongside Greek practices. This inclusivity was not always smooth. Resentment lingered among Macedonians who felt their traditions were being diluted. Still, it marked a significant departure from the purely exploitative empires of the past. Alexander sought not only to rule but to merge, to create a society that reflected the breadth of his conquests. Religion in this society was equally blended. Alexander himself embraced multiple identities: pharaoh in Egypt, son of Zeus Ammon at Siwa, and king of Asia in Persia. His subjects followed suit, weaving together pantheons and rituals. Greek gods were identified with local deities, creating syncretic faiths that reflected the empire's diversity. This religious blending provided not only spiritual unity but also a sense of shared identity among peoples who might otherwise have remained divided. Daily life for ordinary people reflected this mixture of continuity and change. Farmers continued to till their fields much as they always had, but they now sold their surplus in markets that reached further than ever before. Craftsmen created goods that blended styles: Greek pottery with Eastern motifs, jewelry that combined techniques from multiple traditions. Even in diet, fusion appeared: new foods, spices, and cooking methods spread across regions, altering the tastes of households from Greece to India. The army, too, became a society unto itself. Veterans settled in the cities Alexander founded, receiving land and forming communities that anchored Greek presence in foreign territories. These soldiers brought with them their families and their customs, further intertwining Greek ways with those of the lands they occupied. At the same time, many of them took local wives, producing a new generation that embodied the mixed heritage Alexander envisioned. Though not all embraced this blending willingly, it became a reality of life in the empire. Art and philosophy thrived in this environment. Sculptors depicted not only Greek heroes but also rulers in Persian robes or Egyptian crowns. Philosophers debated not only Greek ideas but those encountered from the East, enriching their understanding of the world. Science advanced as well, aided by the exchange of knowledge across cultures. Mathematics from Babylon, medicine from Egypt, and astronomy from India mingled with Greek thought, producing breakthroughs that would echo for centuries. Yet this flourishing society also carried tensions. Wealth was unevenly distributed, with elites enjoying lavish lifestyles while peasants and laborers bore the burdens of taxation and conscription. The fusion of cultures created resentment as often as harmony, with traditionalists on both sides resisting change. For Macedonians who had followed Alexander since the beginning, the sight of their king adopting Persian customs was unsettling, even offensive. For Persians and Egyptians, the imposition of Greek language and institutions sometimes felt like domination rather than unity. Still, the cultural richness of Alexander's empire cannot be denied. It was a society where ideas traveled freely, where art and science crossed borders, where people of different lands lived side by side. It was not a utopia, far from it, but it was a world that reflected Alexander's ambition to create something larger than himself, something that would outlast his lifetime. In the end, the wealth, culture, and society of Alexander's empire formed the true heart of his legacy. The battles won and the cities conquered were fleeting, but the exchange of ideas, traditions, and knowledge endured. The Hellenistic world that grew from his conquests continued long after his death, shaping Rome, influencing Christianity, and laying foundations for modern civilization. It was not merely the empire of a man, but the birth of a world where cultures collided and something new was born. And though his reign was marked by excess and contradiction, the society it produced was vibrant, dynamic, and unforgettable. The cracks in Alexander's empire began to appear long before his death, subtle at first, then widening into deep fractures that threatened to undo all he had built. It is tempting to imagine his conquests as an unstoppable march of glory, but behind the brilliance of his victories lay tensions that festered within his court, his army, and his own vision. These internal struggles would prove as dangerous as any enemy on the battlefield. One of the greatest sources of conflict was the growing divide between Alexander and his Macedonian soldiers. For years they had followed him faithfully, marching through deserts, mountains, and rivers, shedding blood in every corner of the known world. They revered him as a leader who shared their hardships, but as his ambitions grew, he began to distance himself from the men who had made him king. His adoption of Persian customs was particularly offensive to the Macedonians. They had left their homes to carry Greek ideals into Asia, yet now their king wore foreign robes, performed rituals to Eastern gods, and demanded proskynesis, the bowing gesture they considered fit only for slaves. To them, this was not unity but betrayal. The army's discontent came to a head more than once. At Opis in 324 BC, Alexander attempted to integrate Persian soldiers into his ranks, presenting them as equals alongside his Macedonian veterans. The reaction was explosive. His men revolted, furious that the king they had followed for a decade now seemed to favor foreigners. Alexander responded with fury of his own, dismissing his soldiers and declaring that Persians would replace them. The Macedonians, humbled by the threat of their own irrelevance, eventually begged for forgiveness. The reconciliation was staged with tears and gestures of loyalty, but the scars remained. Trust had been broken, and though they still followed him, it was no longer with the same unquestioned devotion. Alexander's relationship with his court was no less strained. Paranoia haunted him in his final years, leading to the deaths of men who had once been his closest companions. The execution of Parmenion, one of his most loyal generals, sent shockwaves through his ranks. The killing of Clitus the Black, who had saved Alexander's life in battle, was even more devastating. In a drunken rage, Alexander struck him down for criticizing his Persianizing ways. Though he mourned the act bitterly afterward, the damage was done. His court no longer felt safe, every word might be misinterpreted, every gesture punished. The camaraderie that had once bound king and companions together was eroding under the weight of fear. The burden of ruling such a vast empire also strained Alexander's administration. His vision of blending Greek and Eastern traditions was ambitious, but it created contradictions that could not easily be resolved. Greek administrators resented sharing authority with Persian nobles, while local populations often viewed Greek settlers as intruders. The attempt to merge cultures created friction rather than harmony, and managing this delicate balance required constant attention. Alexander's solution was often to impose his will with force, but force alone could not mend divisions that ran so deep. Even within his own family, tensions brewed. His marriage to Roxana, a Bactrian princess, alienated many of his Macedonian officers, who saw it as an affront to their own traditions. When he later arranged mass marriages between his soldiers and Persian women, resentment deepened further. Few of the Macedonians embraced these unions willingly, many dissolved them after his death. The cultural fusion Alexander dreamed of was real, but it was fragile, sustained only by his charisma and authority. Without him, it could not survive. We must also consider the toll these struggles took on Alexander himself. The young man who had once seemed so full of fire and clarity now appeared burdened by shadows. His drinking grew heavier, his rages more unpredictable. He spoke openly of his divinity, presenting himself as a living god. To his followers, this claim was both awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling. Was he truly ascending beyond humanity, or was he slipping into the madness of hubris? The line was thin, and his behavior often crossed it. The empire's finances, too, began to show strain. Though the plunder of Persia had filled Alexander's coffers, maintaining his massive armies, funding his building projects, and organizing administration across vast territories drained resources quickly. His men grumbled at delayed pay, and subject peoples groaned under the weight of taxation. Wealth concentrated in the cities, leaving rural areas exploited and restless. Economic discontent added to the list of pressures that threatened stability. All these struggles culminated in a sense of unease that spread across the empire. Alexander's brilliance remained undimmed, but it was matched now by a volatility that frightened his companions. He was a man who had conquered the known world but had not yet conquered himself. His vision of unity, though dazzling, demanded sacrifices that few were willing to make. The Macedonians wanted the spoils of victory, not the burdens of cultural fusion. The Persians saw opportunity in his policies, but also resented the presence of foreign rulers in their lands. Between these poles, Alexander tried to hold everything together, but even his extraordinary will could not erase the contradictions. What emerges from this period is a portrait of a king caught between triumph and turmoil. He had achieved more than anyone before him, but his victories carried seeds of conflict that grew with each passing year. The very policies that were meant to secure his empire's future sowed divisions among his people. His insistence on divine status, meant to unite, instead alienated those who saw him as overreaching. His paranoia, perhaps born from the pressures of endless conquest, drove him to turn on friends and allies. These internal struggles reveal the fragility beneath the grandeur. Alexander's empire was not just a monument of stone and steel. It was an edifice held together by loyalty, trust, and the belief in his invincibility. As those bonds weakened, so too did the foundations of his rule. He remained undefeated in battle, but the cracks within his court, his army, and his vision hinted at the collapse that would come swiftly after his death. Yet the internal fractures of Alexander's empire hinted at instability. The external pressures that bore down upon it made collapse inevitable. No ruler, no matter how brilliant, could conquer the forces of nature or forever hold back the ambitions of rival powers. As Alexander's conquests stretched farther, his empire became harder to sustain, and the threats from beyond its borders grew heavier, grinding away at the unity he had forced into being. Even at the height of his victories, Alexander faced enemies who refused to surrender quietly. In the east, the regions of Bactria and Sogdiana never fully accepted his rule. These rugged lands, with their mountains and fierce tribes, demanded years of campaigning that tested even his unmatched endurance. Guerrilla fighters struck quickly and vanished into the terrain, and revolts erupted as soon as his armies marched away. To tame these lands, Alexander relied on brutal tactics, mass deportations, executions, and forced marriages intended to bind local leaders to his cause. Though effective in the short term, these measures sowed resentment that simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when his iron grip would weaken. Nature, too, became an enemy. The Gedrosian Desert Campaign stands as one of the most harrowing episodes of his reign. Determined to march his men through a path few had ever dared to cross, Alexander led them into a wasteland of scorching heat and endless sand. Supplies ran low, and thousands perished of thirst, starvation, and exhaustion. His decision baffled many, seen as a reckless display of pride rather than strategy. Some argue that Alexander sought to prove that no obstacle, not even nature itself, could deny him. Yet the cost was staggering, and the survivors carried the scars of that ordeal, both physical and psychological. The desert reminded everyone that even Alexander the Great could not bend the natural world entirely to his will. Beyond the challenges of geography, the constant threat of rival powers gnawed at the edges of the empire. The Persians, though defeated, were not entirely gone. Loyalists to the old order still plotted in secret, hoping to restore their dynasty once Macedonian strength faltered. In India, kingdoms beyond the Hydaspes watched with wary eyes, ready to test the limits of Alexander's reach. Even in Greece, long subdued, the spirit of rebellion smoldered. Thebes had been destroyed as a warning, but Athens and other city-states never fully accepted Macedonian dominance. News of Alexander's death would ignite them, proving that conquest abroad had not extinguished dangers at home. Invasions from nomadic tribes added to the burden. Along the northern frontiers, the Scythians and other steppe peoples pressed against his borders, swift and unpredictable. Their mobility and ferocity made them a constant menace, one that could never be fully contained by walls or garrisons. These raiders reminded Alexander that no empire, however vast, could secure every frontier. Each new conquest created new borders, and each border bred new enemies. Disease was another enemy Alexander could not conquer. In the ancient world, plagues moved with armies and caravans, spreading faster than word of victories. The very trade routes that enriched his empire also carried sickness from one end of the realm to the other. Soldiers weakened by long campaigns fell ill, and in some places, entire populations were devastated. These outbreaks drained manpower, disrupted agriculture, and undermined morale. The empire's size, once its greatest strength, became a weakness, for it magnified every problem across thousands of miles. Natural disasters struck with their own terrible rhythm. Earthquakes shook cities, fires consumed temples, and floods swept through fertile lands. Though Alexander rebuilt where he could, each disaster drained resources and reminded his subjects that their king, for all his brilliance, was still powerless against the earth itself. In cultures already steeped in omens and divine signs, such catastrophes were often interpreted as judgments from the gods, fueling doubt about Alexander's claims to divinity. Even his own ambition became an external pressure. The relentless push for expansion stretched his armies to breaking. After more than a decade of war, his men longed for home, but Alexander's gaze was always fixed on the horizon. Arabia was his next target, a land of wealth and mystery, but the campaign never began. His soldiers were weary, his resources strained, and fate intervened before he could set it in motion. The drive for endless conquest, once the source of his greatness, had become a source of exhaustion and resentment, a weight too heavy to bear. These external pressures converged to create a fragile empire, one that depended entirely on Alexander's presence to hold it together. He was the linchpin, the center of gravity, the one figure capable of commanding fear and loyalty across so vast a realm. Without him, every enemy, tribal raiders, rival dynasties, rebellious cities, and even nature itself, would find opportunity to strike. His genius had built something extraordinary, but it was also something unsustainable, a construct that could not withstand the relentless forces pressing against it from without. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BC, these pressures erupted. Revolts broke out in Greece almost immediately. Rival generals carved the empire into pieces, each claiming a share. The lands he had conquered, once bound together by his will, reverted to the chaos of competing powers. The external threats that had been held at bay surged forward, unopposed. The Scythians raided again, Indian kingdoms reasserted independence, and the remnants of Persia found new life in the successor states. The collapse was as swift as his conquests had been. Without Alexander's brilliance to counter them, the external forces proved overwhelming. His empire was like a brilliant flame, dazzling but brief, extinguished not only by his untimely death but by the sheer impossibility of holding back the tide of geography, nature, and rival ambitions. The world he conquered was never meant to be ruled by one man, and yet for a fleeting moment, he had made it so. The fall of Alexander's empire did not come with the defeat of its armies in the field, for Alexander himself remained unbeaten until the end. Instead, it came with his sudden death and the chaos that followed. The collapse was not a single dramatic event but a chain reaction, a slow unraveling of the delicate fabric he had woven across continents. It began in Babylon in 323 BC, when Alexander, after nights of heavy drinking and perhaps weakened by years of exhaustion, fell gravely ill. For days, he lingered, unable to speak, his body racked with fever. His generals gathered around him, desperate for guidance, but when asked who should inherit his throne, he is said to have whispered only, "To the strongest." With those words, or perhaps with no words at all, if later historians embroidered the tale, he left his empire without a clear successor, ensuring that the struggle for power would be violent and absolute. The immediate aftermath was chaos. His wife, Roxana, pregnant at the time, gave birth to a son, Alexander IV. Another potential heir, Heracles, was the illegitimate son of Alexander by a mistress. Neither child could lead an empire of such scale, and neither had the charisma or authority of their father. Power fell into the hands of Alexander's generals, the men who had marched with him, fought for him, and now prepared to fight each other. Known as the Diadochi, these successors carved the empire into fragments, each determined to claim a share of the glory. At first, there was talk of unity, of maintaining the empire in the name of the infant king. A regent was appointed, and territories were divided among the generals as satrapies, with the illusion that they were still bound under a single crown. But ambition cannot be restrained for long. Ptolemy seized Egypt, establishing the dynasty that would endure for centuries. Seleucus carved out a realm in Asia that stretched from Anatolia to the borders of India. Antigonus, Cassander, and Lysimachus fought bitterly over Greece and Macedonia. Each man claimed to be the true guardian of Alexander's legacy, but in truth, each was building his own kingdom on the ruins of unity. The wars of the Diadochi raged for decades, filled with shifting alliances, betrayals, and bloodshed. Alexander's empire, once whole, was reduced to a patchwork of rival states. His dream of a fused civilization was replaced by the reality of dynasties ruled by men whose loyalty was to themselves, not to his vision. The fragile bonds of cultural blending began to fray as each successor prioritized survival over philosophy. Cities rebelled, populations suffered, and the once mighty empire became a battlefield of competing ambitions. For the ordinary people who had lived under Alexander's rule, the collapse was devastating. Farmers who once sold their goods in bustling markets now faced instability as trade routes faltered. Soldiers who had been promised land and wealth found themselves fighting in endless wars between generals. Families who had endured years of conquest were forced once again to endure chaos. The promise of unity that Alexander had offered dissolved into the same fragmentation that had existed before, leaving many to wonder whether his empire had been nothing more than a brief illusion. The fall also carried a symbolic weight. Alexander had sought immortality, to be remembered as more than mortal, a man who had conquered the known world. In life, he had achieved it. But in death, his empire revealed the limits of ambition. Without him, it could not survive. His generals, no matter how skilled, lacked the singular charisma and vision that had held everything together. They could mimic his strategies in battle, but they could not replicate the loyalty he inspired, the belief that he was chosen by destiny. His death exposed the truth that the empire was not a structure built to last, but a reflection of one man's extraordinary force of will. Yet even in its collapse, echoes of Alexander remained. The successor states still bore the marks of his conquests. Greek culture, spread across Asia and Egypt, did not vanish with his empire. The Hellenistic kingdoms carried forward his legacy, blending Greek and Eastern traditions in art, science, and philosophy. But the political unity, the dream of one empire under one ruler, was gone. It had burned brightly, but briefly, extinguished almost as quickly as it had appeared. The fall of Alexander's empire was tragic, but it was also inevitable. The scale of what he had built was beyond the capacity of any one man to maintain, let alone a succession of rivals. His death was the spark, but the collapse was rooted in the very nature of his conquests, vast, ambitious, and unsustainable. In the end, his empire died with him, leaving only fragments for his generals to fight over and only memories for history to preserve. And yet, perhaps this was the final triumph of Alexander. His empire did not survive, but his story did. His name lived on not because of the permanence of his rule, but because of the drama of its collapse. The fall of his empire became part of his legend, a reminder of both his greatness and his mortality. It ensured that Alexander would never be remembered as just another king, but as the conqueror whose vision exceeded the limits of his time, whose fall was as compelling as his rise, and whose legend would outlast the ruins of the world he once commanded. The mysteries that surround Alexander the Great are as enduring as his conquests. His life is one of the best documented of the ancient world, yet even in the abundance of sources, there are gaps, contradictions, and silences that leave us grasping at shadows. It is these unanswered questions that transform his story from history into legend, and they remain as powerful today as they were 2 millennia ago. At the heart of these mysteries lies his death, his tomb, and the enigmatic nature of the man himself. The cause of Alexander's death remains one of history's greatest puzzles. Ancient writers give conflicting accounts. Some describe a sudden fever that struck him after a night of heavy drinking, perhaps malaria or typhoid carried through the fertile but disease-ridden lands of Mesopotamia. Others claim it was poison, a plot hatched by those closest to him, fearful of his growing demands for divine honors and his unrelenting push for expansion. The details are maddeningly vague. He lingered for days, fully aware but unable to speak, a state that has led some modern scholars to speculate about rare diseases or neurological conditions. Was he poisoned, struck down by illness, or weakened by years of wounds, exhaustion, and excess? The truth remains buried with him, a secret that refuses to be resolved. The mystery deepens with his body. Accounts suggest it was preserved in honey, a method thought to ward off decay. His funeral carriage, described as a moving palace of gold and jewels, was intended to return him to Macedon. Yet Ptolemy intercepted it, diverting the prize to Egypt. In Alexandria, the tomb became a shrine visited by emperors and pilgrims alike. But then, it vanished. How could the resting place of the most famous man in the world disappear so completely? Was it destroyed in riots, buried by earthquakes, or deliberately hidden away? For centuries, explorers, archaeologists, and treasure hunters have searched for it, each convinced they might find the lost tomb of Alexander. None have succeeded. Legends sprouted from this absence. Some claimed the tomb was hidden beneath the waters of the Mediterranean, sealed off by time and tide. Others whispered it was taken back to Macedon in secret, lying in some forgotten chamber beneath the soil of his homeland. Medieval travelers told tales of golden sarcophagi, of bodies preserved so perfectly they seemed asleep, of kings who guarded their remains for their own power. Napoleon, during his campaign in Egypt, was rumored to have sought the tomb, perhaps even glimpsed it, though no proof has ever been offered. Each generation adds new layers to the riddle, and with each passing century, the mystery grows. Even Alexander's character carries unanswered questions. Was he truly the visionary who dreamed of uniting East and West, or was that vision simply a mask for ambition without end? His policies of fusion, marrying into local dynasties, adopting Persian customs, encouraging cultural blending, seem progressive, even revolutionary. Yet many of his own men despised them, seeing in them only arrogance and betrayal. Was Alexander ahead of his time, or was he a conqueror who cloaked domination in the language of unity? Historians debate endlessly, but certainty remains elusive. The contradictions extend to his actions. He could be magnanimous, sparing defeated kings and honoring their valor, as he did with Porus in India. Yet he could also be merciless, razing Thebes to the ground, crucifying survivors at Tyre, and ordering executions of those he once trusted. Was this inconsistency the mark of genius, adapting to circumstance, or the sign of a volatile nature ruled by passion and impulse? The sources cannot agree, and so the man remains both hero and villain, light and shadow. Another mystery lies in the question of his divinity. To the Egyptians, he was Pharaoh, a son of the gods. At Siwa, the oracle hailed him as the son of Zeus Ammon. To the Greeks, however, he was mortal, no matter how great. Did Alexander truly believe he was a god, or was it a role he adopted for political necessity, a mask he wore to unite his vast empire? The answer may never be known, for he left no writings of his own, only the stories told by others. The ambiguity lingers, allowing each age to see in him what it wishes, a god in human form, or a man who dared to dream of divinity. The final mystery is the empire itself. Could it ever have survived beyond him? Was it destined to collapse, too vast and too fragile to endure, or could it have flourished had he lived longer? Some argue that his vision of unity might have taken root given time. Others believe it was already unraveling, that the divisions between Macedonian and Persian, Greek and foreign, were too deep to heal. His death made speculation inevitable, for no one will ever know what might have been. These mysteries are not simply gaps in the record, they are the very reason Alexander endures. A man explained fully becomes history. A man left partly hidden becomes legend. Alexander's lost tomb, his uncertain death, his contradictory character, these are the shadows that keep him alive in our imagination. We are drawn not only to his triumphs but to the silence that surrounds them, to the questions that can never be answered. It is in that silence, in those unanswered questions, that Alexander the Great remains immortal. The legacy of Alexander the Great is as vast and complex as the empire he created, a legacy that stretched across continents and continued to shape civilizations long after his body had vanished from sight. Though his empire crumbled almost immediately after his death, the imprint he left upon the world endured, carried forward by the successor kingdoms and remembered in stories, monuments, and ideas that still resonate today. His dream of uniting East and West did not survive intact, but the fusion of cultures he initiated gave birth to a world that bore his influence for centuries. Nowhere is his legacy more visible than in the Hellenistic world that emerged after him. His conquests spread Greek language, art, and philosophy across Asia and Africa, blending them with local traditions to create something entirely new. Greek became the common tongue of scholars and traders, a unifying language that allowed ideas to flow across borders that had once divided peoples. In Alexandria, the city that bore his name, this legacy flourished most brilliantly. Its great library, though eventually destroyed, became a symbol of human curiosity and ambition, a place where knowledge from Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and beyond was gathered under one roof. The city itself became a beacon of culture and learning, a reminder of Alexander's vision of a world connected rather than divided. The arts carried his influence far and wide. Sculptors depicted him not only as a king but as a godlike figure, his image immortalized in marble and bronze. His face, with its youthful features and determined gaze, became a symbol of power and ambition, reproduced across the lands he had once ruled. The style of Greek art mingled with Eastern traditions, producing new forms that reflected the diversity of the empire. Temples rose that blended Greek columns with Persian motifs, statues that fused Egyptian symbolism with Hellenic grace. This synthesis of cultures was the hallmark of his legacy, proof that his conquests had created not just an empire but a cultural revolution. His impact on philosophy and science was equally profound. The mingling of ideas in the Hellenistic world produced advances in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and engineering that would later feed into Roman and, eventually, Western civilization. The exchange of knowledge across regions that had once been isolated was made possible by the networks of trade and communication Alexander had forged. Without his empire, it is difficult to imagine how quickly Greek thought would have spread or how deeply it would have mingled with the traditions of the East. Even religion was transformed by his legacy. The blending of gods and rituals gave rise to new spiritual traditions, many of which endured for centuries. Greek deities were identified with Egyptian ones, and Persian influences found their way into Greek practices. Alexander himself became a figure of worship, revered as divine in some regions, remembered as a hero in others. His presence lingered not just in temples but in myths, shaping how generations understood the relationship between man and God, mortal and immortal. In politics, the successor kingdoms carried forward his influence. The Ptolemies in Egypt ruled for centuries, blending Greek and Egyptian customs to create a dynasty that outlasted even Rome's rise. The Seleucid Empire extended Greek influence deep into Asia, maintaining the networks of trade and culture that Alexander had built. Though these kingdoms often fought among themselves, they preserved the essence of his empire, a world where cultures collided and intermingled, where the boundaries of East and West blurred. Even beyond the lands he conquered, Alexander's name inspired awe. To Romans, he became the standard against which their leaders measured themselves. Julius Caesar wept when he realized he had achieved so little by the age at which Alexander had conquered the world. Napoleon studied his campaigns, seeking to emulate his brilliance. Generals throughout history have looked to Alexander as the model of military genius, a man whose strategies remain studied even today. His name became synonymous with conquest, ambition, and greatness, a title no one else could truly claim. But his legacy is not only about achievements. It is also about questions that linger. His lost tomb, still unfound, ensures that he remains a figure of mystery as well as history. His vision of unity, both inspiring and flawed, leaves us debating whether he was a true visionary or merely a conqueror intoxicated by power. His contradictions, merciful yet cruel, visionary yet paranoid, mortal yet divine, make him endlessly fascinating, a man who resists easy explanation. Modern archaeology continues to search for traces of him, each discovery adding to the richness of his legacy. Coins, inscriptions, ruins of cities he founded, all serve as reminders that Alexander was real, that his life was not only legend but lived history. Yet the absence of his tomb, the silence of his final resting place, keeps his story alive in ways that monuments alone never could. He endures not just because of what we know, but because of what we do not. In the end, Alexander's legacy is not confined to the boundaries of his empire or the centuries immediately after his death. It lives in the very idea of ambition, in the human desire to reach beyond limits, to grasp at immortality, to shape the world with vision and will. His story is told and retold not only because of what he achieved, but because of what he represents, the eternal struggle between mortality and greatness, between the fleeting nature of life and the desire to be remembered forever. His empire fell, his body was lost, his vision remained incomplete. And yet, his legacy endures, stronger than stone, brighter than gold. Alexander the Great remains not simply a man of history, but a symbol of what it means to strive for the impossible, to leave behind a story that time itself cannot erase. Alexander's story is one of triumph and tragedy, of brilliance and mystery, of a man who sought immortality and in some ways achieved it. We have followed his journey from a restless boy in Macedon to a conqueror whose empire stretched farther than anyone before him. We have seen him rise to glory, reshape the world in his image, and fall into decline, undone not by an enemy's sword but by sickness, suspicion, and the weight of his own ambition. We have traced the collapse of his empire, the struggles that followed, and the enduring mysteries that refused to let him rest. And still, centuries later, he remains alive in our imagination, precisely because so much about him is left unresolved. The questions linger. How did he really die? Was he felled by fever, or betrayed by poison in his own court? Where is his tomb, the final resting place that once drew emperors and pilgrims but has now disappeared from history? Did he truly believe in his divinity, or was it a mask he wore to bind together East and West? Could his empire have survived had he lived longer, Or was it destined to fracture under its own weight? These mysteries keep Alexander from fading into the past. They make him not just a figure of history but a presence and legend, a story retold in every generation because it refuses to close. His legacy is written not only in the ruins of cities or the words of ancient texts, but in the influence he still exerts on the world. The spread of Greek language and culture across Asia and Africa, the advances in art, science, and philosophy of the Hellenistic age, the inspiration he gave to generals and leaders for centuries, all of these are threads that connect us to him still. Yet his greatest legacy may lie in the questions we continue to ask. The absence of his tomb is more than a loss to archaeology, it is a symbol of how history itself preserves its most haunting figures. By vanishing, his body became eternal, forever sought, never forgotten. And so, as we close this journey through the rise and fall of Alexander the Great, we are left with both answers and silences. We know he was brilliant, ruthless, visionary, and flawed. We know he changed the course of history in a way few ever have. But we do not know where he lies, nor do we know the full truth of his final days. Perhaps that is fitting. Alexander lived as if he were larger than life, and in death he remains beyond reach, a conqueror who defies finality. What do you think became of Alexander's tomb? Was it destroyed, hidden, or is it still waiting beneath the sands of Alexandria to be uncovered? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below, because this mystery belongs not only to historians but to all of us who are captivated by the past. If you enjoyed this exploration, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Sleepy Dungeons for more deep dives into the lost civilizations and unsolved enigmas of the ancient world. The story of Alexander may be over for now, but countless mysteries remain, each one waiting to be told. And next time, we will step into another forgotten chapter of history, another tale of power, loss, and secrets buried in time. Until then, remember, some stories never end, because the questions they leave behind are greater than the answers we can find.